And Good Daily Podcast. My name is Daniel Dietrich. So glad to be here with you on this Thursday. And on Thursdays, we talk about issues. We try to go past the headlines and the sound bites and get a deeper understanding of the struggles facing us as a nation and as just humans. It's also a Thursday during Pride Month, and we want to amplify and celebrate our friends in the LGBTQ plus community. Around here at Vote Common Good, we believe that every human being is made in the image of the divine, that you are beautifully and wonderfully made. So today our host Doug Pagitt sits down with author, pastor, and therapist Paula Stone WIlliams about her new book, As a Woman, What I Learned About Power, Sex, and the Patriarchy After I Transitioned. In her book and in this interview, she talks openly and honestly about her personal journey and what others in the transgender community experience in our society. It's vulnerable and educational, and a reminder that we as a society, and especially those of us in the church, have so much work to do to create a place where everyone feels safe and celebrated and can thrive. Paula's TED Talks have been viewed over 6 million times, and you can find a link to buy her book in the show notes. Now here is Doug Pagitt with Paula Stone WIlliams.
Paula, I'm so glad to talk to you about this book. You know, I've realized we've known each other for a number of years and always doing other projects, right? We've met trying to organize leaders, trying to move faith movements, trying to be public voices for inclusion. And so we've been together on a number of really great occasions. But when I found myself all of a sudden with your book in my hand, this memoir, it's strange that someone I know and I love and care about all of a sudden becomes real in a different way inside of the pages of a book. So this is a really personal book that you have put together. Can you talk a little bit about that and why the Paula Williams, who's active and moving in the world, really wanted to also take your story and do to it what you do to a story when you put it into a book? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I really didn't want to write this book. I wanted to write a book about gender equity. And my agent had a lot of editors, publishing companies looking at the proposal. And probably half were interested in a memoir, and about half were interested in a book about gender equity. And then it finally ended up kind of coming down to two big publishers and then several smaller publishers. And I would have been happy with probably three of them, but particularly with Simon & Schuster or the other large one, which was Random House. And Random House wanted a book on gender equity. Simon & Schuster wanted a memoir, and they outbid. They gave the highest bid. So it was pretty much that simple. And it's been interesting because reviews, not kind-hearted reviews. I mean, the reviews from places that really don't care a whole lot whether I like their review or not. Most of those are actually speaking very positively about the memoir part and less so about the gender equity part. A lot of the gender equity stuff, their response is kind of like, yeah, nothing new here. You just woke up to it, which has kind of surprised me, I suppose, a little bit, because that is why my TED Talks have had 6 million views, is because women primarily are grateful that I'm validating their experience. But yeah, all but 4 chapters of the book are memoir. Then 2 are about gender equity, and 2 are about why religion behaves the way it does in today's society.
Well, and the title really grabs at it, right? It's As a Woman, so that has that memoir piece, and what I learned about power, sex, and the patriarchy after I transitioned feels like it tells that the other piece of that story, the gender equity side. So for people who haven't yet read the book, your own story is rich with success, presenting as a man, and in the memoir, you start out by talking about your own childhood, and I mean it starts with a bang. This book, right? It starts on your wedding day and your wedding night, and I am so glad you did that, because it's a question a lot of people have about the relationship between gender and sexuality. And there's even a section, I think I pulled it, I dog-eared it, where you say, having my sexuality become entangled with my gender identity was a monumental problem that took a long time to untangle. That's not an uncommon experience for transgender women, especially during the time period when little was known about gender identity and nothing was said about the difference between being transgender, drag queen, sexual crossdresser. It made what was already a difficult season even worse. You're right into the issues that a lot of people have about how to talk about gender and sexuality and transgender and all the rest. Was that important to you to talk about those issues?
Yeah, I think it was. I'm probably one of a handful who were not all that thrilled with one aspect of the new DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, most recent version of it, which has a very large umbrella term for transgender that I think in the functional real world is too broad. I think commonly when people speak of someone who's transgender, they're talking about gender identity specifically, someone who would rather present in and feels more comfortable in and more natural in the gender that was not assigned to them at birth. And the DSM-5 broadens it to include sexual cross-dressers, which is actually a paraphilia and not a gender identity issue, or drag queens, which is just, gay guys with too much style for one gender having fun. And so it really, to me, is a little bit disappointing that they did that, because for a lot of us who knew very early that we were transgender, and I knew at 3 or 4, you get to those teen years and it's inevitable that your sexuality, your first sexual experiences end up being tied with your gender identity. And then you spend a period of time, for some, it can be decades and decades, thinking that maybe I'm not actually transgender. What I am is a sexual cross-dresser. And as a pastoral counselor, I don't work with trans people too much counter-transference, but I will do an intake with them and then transfer them on. And refer them on. I will generally know if a person's gender identity issues predate their puberty, they're transgender. If they arose with puberty, now you've got to ask, are they in fact transgender, or is this in fact a paraphilia? And it takes, I think, a seasoned professional to be able to tell the difference.
So I understand what the difference might be for DSM, because that's the way that the psychological world organizes. What's the practical difference for someone if it arises?
Yeah.
How does that play out?
Well, sexual stressor is aroused by women's clothing. And a typical progression of it is that they're young, they're teens, it's 1 or 2 articles of women's clothing. Then as time goes on, it's more and more until they're dressing completely as a woman and deriving sexual pleasure in it. And so the question that you often ask to try to discern whether someone is a sexual crossdresser and it's a paraphilia, or whether they're transgender is, when did this begin? And if it predates those teen years, those years of puberty, then that's a pretty good indicator that they are in fact transgender and it just got hijacked. But another one is, it's more intimate, but it's the question, when you do find yourself cross-dressing alone and you do bring yourself to sexual climax, what do you do after that? And what you find is, if it's people who immediately take off the clothes because they're done, well, then you know it's a paraphilia. Those who say, oh, it's just kind of good to get it out of the way. It's there. I don't like it. It feels too male, but it's there. And so you get it out of the way, and then you can spend the rest of the day comfortable. Well, that's a fair sign that, in fact, it's a transgender person whose sexuality ended up being held hostage. by the cross-dressing aspect. Because what happens, you're 12, you're 13, your body wakes up. You've been wearing your sister's clothes for a long time, or in my case, your mother's clothes. And all of a sudden you discover that, well, these feel rather sensual. And you have an awakening there. And so it's very easy then. Most boys kind of stumble into masturbation. And so you get there and you make that connection to the clothing. And so it ends up becoming a significant part of your sexuality. The other thing that you know for sure is a negative. If, as a therapist, you recommend that someone goes on anti-androgens and estrogen, you've got to be pretty confident that they're in fact transgender, because the first thing that's going to happen, it's going to take away their male sexuality. And in fact, if this is primarily a paraphilia, and you will find somewhere it is a paraphilia, and the reason they want estrogen is because they want to have their own breasts as their own sexual experience. But as soon as these people have been on estrogen and anti-androgens, anti-testosterone medication for a couple of months, the male sexuality is gone. And if you've chosen poorly as a therapist and as a physician and have put someone on that, and that person is actually a sexual cross-dresser, they're going to be unhappy. They're going to say, oh, wait, this isn't what I wanted because my sexual pleasure is gone. If in fact it's a transgender person, it's just the opposite. For us, it's like, oh, thank God, that very unwelcome, hated aspect of sexuality is finally out of my life.
Wow.
And, that's how a trans person experiences it.
Now, that is such a well articulated and sophisticated range of responses to this issue. Most people obviously don't have this. I was just in a conversation with some friends the other day, and one of the people was saying, "Oh, I'm watching this show about some history of drag queens," and then somebody else in the conversation said transgender, and then this friend of mine said, "No, I think it's drag queens," and he said, "Well, but they're not different, right? Are they like people just the basic language they're trying to figure out and wanting to get it right?" And the three of us who didn't know how to phrase that right just sort of looked at each other like, yeah, I don't really know. I actually thought I'm going to be talking to Paula in a short bit. I'm going to ask her about it. So most people don't even know what terms to use or what categories in their brain. So we just put them in the category of LGBTQ plus and kind of want to be accepting. You, on the other hand, have this very sophisticated way from your own personal experience, I'm guessing, from your work as a trained therapist, from your work as a pastor. Like you're understanding this at a whole other level. When people themselves are finding their own path for their sexual identity and for their gender identity, how often do they know the distinct? Are they closer to where I was in this conversation with friends, or are they closer to where you are when you tend to talk to people? Like, how much do they know?
Yeah, the internet being what it is, there's tons of misinformation out there. So I don't know that people who are on their own, which is most adolescents, really would be able to discern the difference. And it's why it's better to have a therapist who is trained in this issue. Because if you get it wrong as a therapist, this person's life is in your hands. People who are transgender have a 41% suicide attempt rate. Teens who are transgender, whose parents are unsupportive, have a 13 times higher suicide rate than their peers. So there's a lot at stake in this.
It's a health issue.
And it is. And we're only 0.58% of the population. So it's roughly 1 in every 200 people identify as trans. Interestingly, if you look at teenagers right now, the number is more like 2%. And I think that's because there's a new freedom in the millennial generation, Gen Z, to be able to explore their gender identity. I think when it's all said and done, we'll just discover that it is, in fact, about 0.58%, less than 1% that are truly transgender. But it's incumbent on a therapist to know the questions to ask, because they're critically important. one of the things I say to parents of trans kids is, if your child has consistently, persistently, from a very early age, said what my neighbor's daughter said, identified as a male at birth, her first phrase was, "Mommy, I a girl." And when you have a child that's protesting that from as early as everyone can remember, you can know that that child is in fact transgender. If you have a child who at 13 says, "Yeah, I think I'm transgender," it's like, okay. Or you might just be a 13-year-old trying to figure out your identity. And it's fine for you to explore all that. But as a parent, I should not be rushing you off for medical treatment for this, because it is in fact likely just an exploration of identity. And that's a marvelous thing that kids are able to do that. But you find some parents on the far liberal spectrum just want to rush off for testosterone blockers, estrogen blockers. And it's like, oh, well, let's just hold off on that. How long has your child been saying this? And if it's long term, okay. But if it's relatively new, we might want to wait a little while.
I'm sure this is very difficult for parents to want to know how to respond wholeheartedly, fully, and acceptingly, and not feel like, well, little sweetie, you're just going through a stage, and having to navigate that, and how you would say, maybe this is something you're exploring for now. We should wait a while. That this is new territory for an awful lot of parents. When you were 13, did you talk about this at all? So you were 13, at a period of time in the, when the world didn't have a lot of categories for this, but there were cross-dressing, drag queens, other phrases that people would use, that were certainly around culture. Were you aware of that in your own growing up? Did you see people on television or that kind of
thing? Not drag queens. The awareness of cross-dressing as a sexual paraphilia, and one of the more common ones. That stuff just wasn't really known at that time, and so the only thing that was there were a handful of people who were called transsexuals who had transition genders. The most famous was Christine Jorgensen. And I remember rushing home from high school to watch Merv Griffin interview her. That for me was a cathartic moment and a really a life-altering moment, because I realized, it's really possible to do this. People really can transition genders. But I believe, a senior in high school at that point.
Did you tell anyone you were going to rush home to watch that? Did people know?
Oh my God, no. I was in a fundamentalist family. My father was a fundamentalist pastor. I was in very conservative Eastern Kentucky. That wouldn't go so well today, let alone back then. Right. So, no, I never told anyone until a college professor was the first person.
Were you also, at that time, you were in that setting, but did you also have your own internal narrative struggling with it, wondering if that was... what did it feel forbidden internally? Did you feel like you're violating yourself at all?
Yeah, I think it felt internally forbidden, because once I saw that show and realized this is really possible, that brought a whole new realm of terror into my life, because it was really possible. And so I found it critically important at that point to deny its reality and to decide I was just a sexual cross-dresser.
So we live in this period now, and I want to dip back into your story in a minute, but just to connect it to the political moment we're in. When you were growing up, it was sort of forbidden, maybe seen as an oddity and joked about. At least that's the world that I was in. Whether it was Klinger on MASH or I just sort of knew that there were people who were transgender or cross-dressing or transvestite, I think was a word. And, this was a thing, the Rolling Stone songs about it. So it was around and it was an oddity, but it didn't feel like it was the middle of a political battle. And now we have this level of openness that issues of transgender have been added to the conversation around how do we be sure our society protects people. And now we're in this moment where there's bills being passed in House, state legislatures and at the federal level wanting to address issues of who can play in what sports teams and what identity do you have to identify with and what bathroom can you use. All of a sudden now it's the opposite side of being sort of private and obscure but known to being so public, and yet people know as little about it. It feels like now in 2021 as people it seems like people knew in 1971. How does that feel? And much of this has happened just in the last few years as you've been more public about your own gender identity and being who you are. How is that for you and for others that you know who are living through this kind of experience?
Well, I think you can't take it personally. I think you have to understand the bigger picture. And so I go all the way back to the work of sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson, who's won a couple of Pulitzers on this subject, or, well, generally speaking, the subject. His first was identifying that the key social unit for the human species is the tribe, not the nuclear family. His second was identifying 9 tribal species. And we're one of the 9. And those tribal species have what Richard Dawkins would call a selfish gene. But then they also have what Wilson calls a tribal gene, that they'll sacrifice themselves for the sake of the tribe. An enemy comes into the camp. The tribe unites, defeats the enemy. Some die. The tribe survives. Life goes on. He says 8 of these 9 species, which he calls eusocial, E-U-S-O-C-I-A-L. He says 8 of these 9 eusocial species have evolved exactly as you would expect. And, just the only reason that the tribe unites to defeat an enemy is when an enemy presents itself. He said the 9th eusocial species has unfortunately evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. And where no enemy exists, we create one. He said, we don't get a hold of that, we lose the species and quite possibly the planet. And when you take a look at what's happening today, as soon as the Supreme Court upheld marriage equality, everything shifted to transgender issues, which interestingly are completely not spoken of in Scripture at all. They try to force a Genesis 1 passage to mean that, but I mean, any first grade biblical scholar knows that simply isn't true. So they've created a new set of enemies, and unfortunately, it's a very vulnerable population. So at this point, 9 states have passed laws. There are over 30 states with over 300 laws pending that remove the civil rights of transgender people, 12 in Texas alone. And we know that the law that passed in Alabama is forcing several hundred trans kids who were receiving medical treatment specific to their sexual identity and their gender identity. Those kids now have to go outside the state of Alabama for treatment. Children are going to die because of this. And all it is creating enemies that don't exist. I wrote an op-ed for CNN a couple of weeks ago where I said, if you're going to pick on somebody, pick on me. I mean, I've had a lifetime of white male entitlement.
Nice.
And I can speak up and stand up and point out the absolute ridiculousness of your complaints, particularly with the bathroom law. It's like, okay, show me one time ever where a trans person has ever been in a bathroom for nefarious purposes. On the other hand, over the last 20 years, 3 of the largest insurance companies in the US that insure only Protestant churches, key point, have paid out over 7,000 claims of sexual abuse against clergy in Protestant churches. So you tell me, where does the threat lie? Does it lie in trans people in a bathroom? And interestingly, it's not political conservatives who are coming up with these laws. Yes, it's Republicans in the legislatures who are introducing them, but they did a study of Trump voters in the 10 swing states on election day. Ask them, Trump voters, should transgender people have the same civil rights as everyone else? 60% said yes. Of all ages, all political stripes, all conservatives. So then where's this
Yeah.
drive coming from? It's evangelical Christians, 84% of whom believe gender is immutably determined at birth. 66% who believe that we've already gone much too far in the United States in accommodating transgender people, and yet only 25% who've ever met somebody who's trans. So it is American Christianity at its evangelical and fundamentalist expression. That's who's decided we're the enemy.
And you are one of the Venn diagram centers of both of those worlds, right? Having been an evangelical pastor, an evangelical leader, and also knowing that you were presenting in an identity, gender identity that didn't fit you, and then came out and are still pastoring and still leading. So you're continuing to do that work. That there's truly a handful of people, I think, that would fit this category. And that other part of your book, we've talked a lot about the as a woman side, but the part of the book that raises the question of what you learned about power and sex and the patriarchy after you transition. You have a unique perspective on that. What, not to keep people from buying the book, I think it'll help them buy it all the more. What have you learned about power, sex, and the patriarchy since you transitioned? What's the reality that you now know to be true?
Yeah, I just drove home a few minutes ago and was listening to Colorado Public Radio, and pretty soon my voice came on. They're choosing to use my book as their large live group discussion book for the summer. And the soundbite they chose, which I think they've been running all month, is a soundbite where I say there's no way a well-educated white male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. Conversely, there's no way a woman can understand the full import of that. She might have an inkling she's working twice as hard for 2/3 as much, but she has no idea how much more difficult life is for her than it is for the guy in the Brooks Brothers jacket across the hall. I know. I was that guy. That's the section that they played. And that is, in fact, kind of the essence of it. And I have in the book recommendations I make to men that I think are critically important. And then also recommendations I make to women where I think they don't help themselves very much. And I think that all of those on both sides are pretty important because guys just don't know what they don't know. I don't think there are very many guys who intend to be misogynistic. A handful, I'm sure, with weak ego structures, but the majority of them just don't know what they don't know. So yeah, I do talk about that in the book. I talk about men learning the value of deference, that deference is not a respected male trait. I point out that men don't know how to collaborate, how to compromise, or how to be open to correction. And there I find it interesting because the 6 countries that did extremely well in the early stages of coronavirus were Germany, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Taiwan, and New Zealand, all of which have a female head of state. And the 3 that did spectacularly poorly were Brazil, the United States, and Great Britain. Duh. So you see the value of people who are willing to compromise, be open to correction, and collaborate. So yeah, and then I don't think listen enough to men. Men interrupt women twice
I'm sorry,
as often as they
Paula,
interrupt other men.
you sort of fuzzed out there. Would you just say that line again? Because I think it's a really important one. I didn't hear all of it.
Men do not truly listen to women. They really don't. Men interrupt women twice as often as they interrupt other men. And I always say, speaking to corporations or conferences, if there's one single thing guys could do, it would be assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly, which means then affording her a platform where she's not being interrupted, where the assumption is made that she does know what she's talking about. I remember a couple of years ago, not even quite that long, I'm on the board of a large religious nonprofit that has a national conference, and we had a new CEO, and we're talking about having her speak for the conference, and she's not a seasoned speaker. And so I said, well, she's not really a seasoned speaker. Might be better if we interview her. I'd be happy to do that. But if you want her to give a keynote, I'd be glad to coach her. At which point a powerful white gay male in the room said, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we hire a real coach? And I waited for someone to speak up. I what I wanted to say was, wait, hang on, wait, hang on just a minute there. I've done 4 TED Talks. I've coached TEDx speakers. I'm a speaker's ambassador for TED. I've taught speech in 3 seminaries, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. Just tell me what part of that doesn't make me a real coach? But I didn't say anything, because if you say something, you're just that woman.
Mm.
And in this setting, a woman is assumed to have just one area of expertise by
Nice.
men, and she's not allowed to have any more than that. And as far as he was concerned, the reason I was on the board was he knew that I used to teach a doctoral course called Current Trends in American Religion. So I was apparently somewhat of an expert on American religion. Didn't occur to him that I also could know something about giving speeches.
Mm-hmm.
Because a woman isn't judged in the aggregate body of her work. She's
Wow.
judged on one narrow slice of it. And if you happen to be a Renaissance person like I am, that doesn't work in your favor.
Yeah. You've had the experience of your body chemistry changing, the amount of testosterone in your body. I heard a study, and I'm going to try to get this right, but it was about the amount of testosterone. They measured testosterone in men in boardrooms. And one of the things they found is just by having a woman in the boardroom, even if she doesn't speak, just physically around the same table, the testosterone level drops of all the men. Like there's the pheromones and whatever goes on happens. And so we can literally have a different chemical makeup of our own bodies and collective bodies by having the right people in a space with us. You've experienced living with the physiology, testosterone physiology of a man, and with that being of different levels, diminished levels, as a woman. Did any of those impulses that you now see so clearly that were in men, did some of that shift in you when the testosterone levels went down? In other words, do you find that some of this is biologically initiated, or is it a mental, psychological practice solely for someone to engage? And I'm not trying to let men off the hook. I'm just trying to say you have a unique perspective and experience to know from where in a person are these drives coming, and we have to deal with them regardless of where they come from. But did you notice a change and shift in you?
Yeah, I wish I was asked that question more often, because it's massive. It's really massive. Any man who would lose all of his testosterone is going to be fundamentally changed, because you realize that we are psycho, socio, spiritual, somatic beings. All of these things are carefully integrated into one living entity. And when you change the physiology of one of those people, just think about the changes a woman goes through during menopause and how significant those changes are, not just physiological, but emotional changes for that woman, and how hard it can be for a lot of women for up to 10 years as they go through that. That's how massive the changes are to lose testosterone and to have no testosterone functioning any longer. I'm still an alpha. I mean, there's no question about that. But I no longer have to deal with the levels of anger I did before. I don't have to win in the way I did before. I don't have to control a room in the way I did before. I can sit back and let others lead without any difficulty whatsoever. It's, if there's utter incompetence, no. But, as long as the world's functioning fairly well, it's like, okay,
Yeah, I understand.
we have 4 of us who are co-pastors at Left Hand, and I think we're really honestly co-equals. I don't think any one of us is really, driving to control the setting. But yeah, the loss of testosterone is, it's massive, not just physiologically because you lose power and strength, muscle mass, but it's emotionally a very different kind of experience. Henry Nouwen always used to say that the world's greatest leaders had equal parts confidence and humility.
Hmm.
And when I look at those six heads of state, particularly people like Angela Merkel or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, I see women who, in fact, have great confidence, but coupled with great humility.
Yeah.
It's much more rare you see men have that combination. And I think a fair amount of that is our enculturation. We've not been taught to defer, for instance. But I think a lot of it is physiological. I think a lot of it is, in fact, testosterone. The first thing men do when they get in a room is determine who the alpha is in the room. I've watched that with you. I've watched religious leaders come into a room with you and start posturing to see who the alpha is. It was fun for me to watch because it took me back to my days as a man. And in the settings I was in, to pretty quickly realize that you were, in fact, the alpha male in the room. Men then really pretty quickly will rank themselves according to the alpha. That's fun to watch too, because they'll do it rather generously. They'll kind of think to themselves, well, I'm number two clearly in this. And you've got probably, 20 or 30 number twos in this, but they all know their job. And, we even have a sport in the United States that is a visual reminder of that, because 11 guys get in a circle, smack each other in the butt, and then advance the quarterback and his ball down the field. So we've identified who the alpha is.
That's why football is the American sport, right?
It's in the very nature of the sport. Yeah.
Yeah.
Women don't do that. Women will become very competitive with each other, and women do not empower one another. And I don't like that at all. But they don't have that same, I think, natural inclination, if I can say that, to rank themselves according to whoever the alpha is in the room.
That thing you're describing is very real, and it's rooted in a whole lot of things. I'm like you. I'm outside the curve on size. I'm a big person, 6'7", and 230 pounds, and a deep voice, and all those things that all send these clues that are just having to take them into account and to navigate them and to be body aware is a real thing. Like, it's a real practice. You and I sort of share this, like having to figure yourself out as a big person in a space. You occasionally look at pictures or something, you're like, oh my gosh, I am hovering over that person. And all I think I'm doing is just having a conversation, but there's this dominance imagery, and they're looking up and I'm looking down, and all that stuff just screws with your head. So you really have to be mature and attuned and sort of grow into that. I've had to grow into that over years and years and years. Your transition was even more severe than that, because now you're not being responded to in the way you were before. Now you're not only in the category of not being male, but you're a transgender female. And that must be a thing that people have a separate category for, right? Like, they certainly use the pronouns that you want and use the feminine pronouns for you. But do you feel like there's a different category for a transgender person than male and female? Like, is it an in-between spot?
Yeah, it's that would be one of the places where I can only talk about this transgender person.
Okay.
For me, no, I don't think so. I was talking with one of my co-pastors this morning. I was in rural eastern Kentucky the last couple of days going to visit my father's grave. And of course, a very Republican, extremely right-leaning region. And I never have any difficulty when I go there, because I'm never seen as a transgender person. I'm just seen as a tall woman. And that is, for me, pretty much a gigantic blessing. I am never ridiculed in public.
Really?
So unless people happen to know that I'm transgender, the experience I have is pretty much the same as a cisgender woman in America. It's just not an issue for me.
Okay.
I think the only time I have ever been identified as trans in a population that did not already know it is if I was with a lot of other trans people And I think at that point it is just my height that caused them to think, oh, okay, there's these other 10 trans people here. She must be trans too, since she's over 6 foot tall. So I'm really quite fortunate that way. And then in the world that knows I'm trans, there, it's, I think it actually gives me more power because it's a world that's extremely supportive of transgender people. So I think of my relationship with the folks at TED, for instance, or at TEDx Mile High, which is one of the largest TEDx's in the world. I serve on their content and curation committee. Or my experience with Simon & Schuster in writing my memoir, or a lot of companies that I work with on a regular basis. I am afforded the utmost respect in those settings.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to hear that. The transition from male to female is your experience. What should we know about people who transition from what was, assigned gender of female to male? Is that a similar, do people have similar experiences as far as you know? I mean, I certainly know people who've gone through this too, but I'm wondering what your experience is.
They're significantly different for one reason. Their experience would be closer to mine, just the opposite, the flip side of mine. Because trans men, 3 to 4 years post-transition, 3 to 4 years after going on testosterone, are virtually never seen as transgender. They sound, look like men, like cisgender men. So they don't experience the kind of public humiliation that a lot of trans women experience. So their experience on these other issues it's just the flip of mine. I did a book launch event last week with a bookstore, a virtual book signing event in St. Louis. And one of the owners and the person who moderated the conversation was a delightful man who I didn't realize until well into the conversation was trans. And, we were talking, I don't think it was actually on camera. I think it was after, about how Jonathan calls me dad and his child calls him mom. And, when he said my child calls me mom, I'm like, oh, that's a disconnect. That for me is like, wait, what? And I realized that's how people respond when Jonathan calls me dad. Because I did not see a woman there, a mother there. And people look at me and don't see a father there either.
That's one of the questions I remember some friends of mine saying, that when gay marriage became legal in the state of Minnesota, that saying to other people who didn't know how to talk about it, like, no, we're both husbands. Like the name of a married man, the phrase for married man is husband. Husband doesn't need a wife to be a husband. Like this language stuff, because language, it helps frame and form our categories. For you and Jonathan, that's a relational name. That's not related to gender. Is that right? Is that how you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's about perfect. And my girls call me Paula. They don't call me dad. So that's interesting. Jonathan in public generally will call me Paula. But yeah, when we drop into our, talking about the New York Mets or talking ministry, it's still father and son.
Yeah. It's we just realize it's all the social construct we have around all of these issues, right? Which we make. And I know there's a big argument that's in the world, and this is where the evangelicals root this in some sort of order and natural order. Like, it's very curious. These creationists, short earth creationists also somehow fall into like natural order, like they're Darwinian or something. So it's very curious shift that they make.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I mean, you see it particularly with intersex. We know there are at least 16 well-identified intersex conditions. And they say, yeah, but in Genesis 1, it says God created a male and female. Well, apparently God didn't, because there are all of these intersex conditions. And we know with transgender people that even before hormonal treatment, their brains are significantly different than cisgender people. So, it's just,
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because intersexed is another category. That's people for whom chromosomally and biologically, if I have this right, they have the markers of both genders.
and all kinds of combinations in between.
Yeah. Yeah, all these combinations. That has been. I have a friend who does her work in this, and she's written some books about this. And getting into that world was so eye-opening to me. Right, like not the moral categories, not just the social categories, not the gender categories, but this biological categories. Realizing, oh, we talk about this with a kind of imprecision that's not necessary, and is a bit harmful. It seems to me, and the intersexed conversation where parents are meeting with doctors and having to decide your child is not definitively one or the other. You have some decisions to make here because sometimes they're born with genitalia that matches both genders. Is that right? Am I right about that?
Yeah.
And so there's decisions that people are having to make. So this idea that somehow things are just clear and then people like you are messing up the lines, that's not the description that I think matches any reality.
Right. You take things like Klinefelter syndrome, which is double XY.
Okay, tell me what that is again. Remind me. So double X.
I mean, women are generally double X and men are XY, but Klinefelters are double XY. And so that's truly both sexes at this, basic, even genetic level. And then you get androgen insensitivity disorder. There are a plethora of them that are pretty much unknown in the general public. Megan Franz's, I think maybe even who you're referring to.
Yeah, Megan's.
Yeah, she's done amazing work on this subject. A short version on this that's worth going to is Radiolab's series Gonads, which I consulted on. They did an amazing job on their one show that dealt with intersex conditions.
Yeah, I heard that. It just fascinating. This. All of this is so rich for people, right? Like they're just people are. It seems to me that most people, they want to do the right thing, and we're working with whatever information we have about doing the right thing. One of the questions that I've been sort of struggling. It feels to me like the group. We're in a period of time where there's a lot of grouping of social categories. So the letter list of LGBTQ plus is one of those, and there's kind of a you're supposed to say it in that order, and maybe there's even some that follow it, or the racial category of BIPOC feels all of those kinds of shorthands that clump groups. I feel a little uncomfortable that they're somewhat dismissive, right? It's sort of like, oh, gay, lesbian, transgender, queer, that's a thing. They are a thing. That group in that letter set is a thing, or Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, that they're a separate thing. And I feel like, I don't know, we need more handles to get to this. Like, it's good that we can shorthand so we know what we're talking about and be sure we're being inclusive. But it also feels like it's a little clumpy, and as if transgender is a deeper version of lesbian or gay or something, and it's not. Do you feel that at all on any of those issues? Does it feel like we need more precision, more handles, more ways to talk about all this?
And I think that is a good question to ask in terms of how much is culture. I think maybe some of this is a question for even the biologists or the anthropologists. Do we need to categorize? Is that something that is in fact baked into the DNA of what it means to be human, that we must create and operate in categories? I find that most environments in the West that are focused on the first moral standard. I'll say more about that in a second. Eventually get at language that works. So like, for instance, the style book at Simon & Schuster has come to the point where in the past year, it's LGBTQ plus is what's used for everything published by Simon & Schuster. And race is now capitalized. But it took them a while to get to that point. So, Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind says there are three basic moral foundations in the world. Says there are those who believe that there's no greater moral good than to look out for the best interest of the individual. And that would be the secular West. And even the religious West in its more liberal expressions. And that's the world to which I'm referring. And the second moral standard are those who say that there's no greater moral good than to protect the integrity of the tribe, which would be developing nations, and even some groups that are religious fundamentalists. The third is more specific to religion, that there's no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods. And this is true of fundamentalism in all of its forms, wherever you find it. And so if you're looking at those last two moral foundations, there's no greater moral good than to protect the integrity of the tribe, or no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods. You're really not interested in the first, which is that there's no greater moral good than to protect the rights of the individual. But that is, I believe, the moral foundation as a species that has allowed us to make leaps forward. And that is, in fact, the moral foundation that drives the secular West. It's also, and make no mistake about this, what evangelical America is fighting against. No question, what they would like to do is force us to live. It is Handmaid's Tale. Force us to live according to social rules that are established from the perspective of there's no greater moral good than to obey the teachings of the gods, as defined by their exclusively male leaders.
Yeah, by the tribe, right? And I would say, as someone from that tradition, the teachings of Jesus call you into the first category, via teaching of one anotherism, and so the fact that those that Jesus himself and the Gospels and the canonized scriptures are calling people to get rid of that follow the gods at all costs, and to get rid of your tribe should win over all the other tribes. This is so this is deep irony, right?
Yeah.
Where the very texts speak against but I guess that's true in so many cases, where the very texts that we hold to speak against the perversions that seem to hold those texts so tightly. It's just really ironic how we make our way here. Do you feel like there's I know you said that transgendered people are now in the crosshairs of the cultural war, that we've accommodated in this society to a point of acceptance of gays and lesbians having the same rights as others, at least civilly. So the battle, very few people think that's going to ever be reversed. So the new battle is now to move on to transgender. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. But if that's the case, what do you think allies to transgendered communities need to do or to be or to how to behave as to be the most engaged and helpful in that struggle?
I always say when I say to groups of men that the one thing men could do that would make a huge difference is to assume a woman knows what she's talking about and treat her accordingly. I say that and stop interrupting us. Stop interrupting us. And everybody always laughs, but I say that's big. And then I say, and if there's one thing you could do that would shut the whole thing down, is if you as a man would say, "Excuse me, I don't believe she was done yet."
Wow.
Then she doesn't have to do it herself. And you've used your power to say to the other man, "Don't do that again." It's interesting. Yeah. You have that happen to you once or twice. You don't interrupt women anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing when it comes to the transgender community. I have no choice but to fight for myself. You can choose to do so or not do so. And I think for particularly uh, white men to speak up and say, this stuff is dangerous, people are dying, cut it out. I think that is the most important work
Mm.
that can be done. It's one of the reasons I very happily serve whenever I'm asked to by the Biden White House. I'm doing an event on the 30th with Pete Buttigieg and Rachel Levine, where I think 6 or 7 of us are going to talk with them about the Equality Act and the importance of that, because the only way for us to stop these state rules from being adopted is to adopt the Equality
Yeah.
Act at a federal level, which will supersede those. At this point, demanding, unless we're willing to get rid of the filibuster, I don't think it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm certainly willing to speak on its behalf because I think it's critical.
Well, I'm with you, and I will add to that list that picking up this book by Paula Stone WIlliams as a woman is one of the ways you can learn the story. And I am glad you went with the deal that made it a memoir, because I think the personal story, I think the access to you as a person, to the lived experience, is so incredibly powerful in this book. And I think it's one of the ways that people can access, especially religious people, frankly. Like, not everyone's story has the same handholds, and it's like going to one of those rock climbing walls, and you look at one of the walls and you're like, I could never climb that one. And you look at the other and you think I could get my hands onto those. And people need these handholds, and they need to see
Right.
and hear people telling the story the way that you so deftly do in this book. So, Paula, thank you for your advocacy, and I miss you so much, and so good to see you.
Oh, I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much for having me.
And that is our show. Great conversation. You can pick up the book wherever books are sold. You know how to buy books. I don't need to tell you how to buy books, but there is a link in the show notes, so you can find it there. And again, we've got a Vote Common Good ride coming up, wethepeopleride.org. We're going to be riding across the southern border to raise awareness for conditions at the border and just raise voices and celebrate those doing the hard work at the border to make this a welcoming place for those who are seeking a better life here. And so check out that, wethepeopleride.org. Get involved, find ways to, if you can't join us on the border, maybe set up a ride in your own neighborhood, in your own community, but find a way to be involved and raise awareness in that way. We'll be back Monday, and thanks for joining us, as always, on the Vote Common Good Daily Podcast. I'm Dan Dietrich. We'll see you soon.